Now we move on to cellular adaptations, specifically hypertrophy. In the previous session, we highlighted that cells are adapting to stress in many different ways, and one of these is going to be hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is where the cells are going to be increasing in size to meet increased demands. You can think of bodybuilders who are trying to gain muscle, or patients that have high blood pressure, that have problems with their heart. These are all examples of hypertrophy. We're going to be covering them and many more in this video, where we're going to be breaking down what hypertrophy is, how it happens, and why it matters clinically. So let's get started. Before diving in, let's outline what we're going to be covering in this session. By the end of this session, you should be able to define hypertrophy, differentiate between physiological and pathological hypertrophy, explain the mechanism behind hypertrophy, identify the clinical relevance of hypertrophy, including, for example, its role in diseases like heart failure, apply knowledge of hypertrophy to clinical scenarios and understand its impact on organ function. So, what is hypertrophy? Hypertrophy is defined as an increase in the size of an organ or tissue through an increase in the size of the individual cells and not an increase in cell number. So, hypertrophy is when the size of the organ or the tissue increases. So, the individual cells are going to get bigger and never the number of cells because that's going to be hyperplasia. That's a different mechanism. So, this happens usually because the cells themselves are going to undergo changes that increase protein synthesis in it. Hypertrophy actually has two types. It can be physiological hypertrophy, which usually happens in normal adaptations in response to certain stimuli, or it could be pathological hypertrophy, which usually occurs due to disease processes that stress out the tissue. All right, so we know what hypertrophy is. It's that when the cells are getting bigger, but how does that actually happen? Let's break it down step by step, the mechanism behind hypertrophy. First, the cell needs to detect a stimuli. It doesn't just start to hypertrophy out of nowhere. This stimuli could be either mechanical or hormonal. Mechanical, the example of lifting weights or exercise. Hormonal, like growth factors, for example. This is going to be resulting in specific genes that are going to be turned on in response to the stimuli, and it kickstarts a process that tells the cell to start building protein. So, number one is gene activation. Specific genes are activated in response to signals, mechanical stresses, hormonal stressors that are going to be initiating protein synthesis or protein production. Next, once these genes are activated, the cell is going to become capable of making structural proteins or starts to make more structural proteins, especially actin and myosin. And these proteins are really important for contraction in muscles. These makes the cells stronger and capable of handling these increased demands. So protein synthesis is going to happen next, and this leads to the synthesis of structural proteins like myosin and actin, and these increases the structural integrity of the cell. After that, it's important that the organelles get bigger. It's not just the cell that is growing, the organelles itself inside the cell are also expanding. For example, the powerhouse of the cell, mitochondria, needs to be able to create more ATP. So maybe we're going to have more mitochondria to keep up with the increased workload. The ribosomes in the endoplasmic reticulum are going to be working over time to pump out new proteins. So these enlargement of the organelles is going to be very essential because the organelles like the mitochondria, the ribosomes, and the endoplasmic reticulum are going to be growing to support the increased cellular activity and the energy requirements. But this entire process is not just happening willy-nilly. It is very tightly controlled by signaling pathways inside the cell. An example is the P13K AKT mTOR pathway, which is sort of like a growth switch. It's important and very crucial for normal hypertrophy. For example, if a person is having exercise or is exercising, their skeletal muscle are going to be having normal hypertrophy through this pathway. We have other pathways that you can read through, like the G protein coupled receptor pathway. That's usually triggered by pathological hypertrophy, like in heart disease. And then you have the calcineurin and FAT pathway, which is usually responsible for also heart and muscle cell hypertrophy, and it is related to calcium signals. Now we can cover the key features of hypertrophy. We already mentioned them, so this is just a summary. Number one, it is increase in the size of the cell. So a lot of people confuse between hypertrophy and hyperplasia. This is why I keep emphasizing it that here it is increase in the size and not the number. In contrast to hyperplasia, hypertrophy results in the enlargement of the individual cells and not cell multiplication, which happens in hyperplasia. It also occurs in response to an increased workload or stress. So the cell are going to undergo hypertrophy due to mechanical stressors, hormonal stressors, or pathological conditions, like we mentioned. And the most prominent tissues that are affected by hypertrophy are usually the permanent tissues. Hypertrophy is most noticeable in the permanent tissues like the heart, the skeletal muscles, nerves, are usually all the tissues that don't regenerate new cells easily. As for the types of hypertrophy, we can have good hypertrophy or bad hypertrophy. First is good, which is physiological hypertrophy. Think exercise. The muscle needs to grow. That is muscle hypertrophy. It is healthy and beneficial because you can have stronger, bigger muscles after training, after exercise, after running, because there's going to be a stress on these muscles, which are requiring more energy to be able to keep up with the increased demand that you gave it when you start to exercise, for example. And this is going to become a type of healthy hypertrophy. And then you can have pregnancy. So when the fetus is growing inside the uterus is required to expand and to become larger and enable it to support this fetus. And that's why this is another type of healthy physiological hypertrophy and is usually under hormonal stimuli. Estrogen, for example, is going to be very important in both the menstrual cycle and the pregnancy. Pathological hypertrophy or bad hypertrophy. So you can have, for example, hypertensive heart disease. So the heart is going to be working harder against this high blood pressure. So if a patient has high blood pressure, it's going to be much harder for the heart to pump against this pressure, and that's going to require the heart to work even harder. And then this stimuli is going to lead to hypertrophy. It's usually more prominent in the left ventricular hypertrophy when related to high blood pressure. You can also have obesity. So the fat cells can start to enlarge and they can contribute to metabolic complications, which we're going to be covering. You can also have hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, in which is usually due to a genetic condition that causes abnormal heart muscle growth. So let's cover some of the examples we mentioned before, pathological hypertrophy examples, in more details. So, number one, we have hypertensive heart disease, in which we have chronic high blood pressure causing left ventricular hypertrophy leading to heart failure. So, this chronic high blood pressure, what does it do? It forces the heart to pump against an increased resistance, and this causes the left ventricle to hypertrophy, making the heart muscle thicker, less flexible, and eventually it can lead to heart failure and even arrhythmias. Another example is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, in which we have a genetic disorder where the abnormal heart muscle hypertrophy leads to arrhythmias and sudden death. So the way that this happens is that this genetic mutation causes abnormal thickening of the heart muscle, especially the intraventricular septum. This is also known as hook'em. So this can lead to basically a blockage of the blood flow from the left ventricle, a left ventricular outlet obstruction, and it can even create electrical instabilities which lead to arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death, especially in young athletes. So usually if you have those vignettes where they tell you this young athlete who is very promising and suddenly out of nowhere in the middle of a game they drop um, unresponsive and they're pronounced dead, usually they have hook'em. They have this hypertrophy due to this genetic disorder. Next, we can have obesity or adipocyte hypertrophy. So if a patient or any person has excess calorie intake, this can lead to fat cell enlargement, so adipocyte hypertrophy. The problem with this is that it leads to worsening metabolic dysfunction, meaning it can increase insulin resistance, inflammation, and this fat storage is going to be contributing to diabetes, to cardiovascular disease, to metabolic syndrome. Next, we can also have compensatory kidney hypertrophy. So after the loss of a kidney and nephrectomy, the remaining kidney is going to be undergoing hypertrophy to compensate for the loss of function. So let's say someone donates their kidney. Um, or it's just non-functional. It doesn't have to be donated, but non-functional. Both of them can result in compensatory hypertrophy. The remaining kidney at this point is going to be required to do the work of two kidneys. So it's going to be growing larger to be able to handle this increase in workload. This adaptation can help maintain kidney function, but it can also increase the risk of hypertension and chronic kidney disease over time. These are the pathological examples of hypertrophy. Now, for more details on the physiological hypertrophy examples, we can have more details on exercise induced hypertrophy. For example, resistance training can cause muscle fiber hypertrophy and increases muscle strength and endurance. So, the way that this works is that resistance training places mechanical stress on the muscle fibers and it triggers the hypertrophy, where the muscle cells are going to be enlarging, strengthening, and it can lead to increased muscle mass, which leads to increased strength and endurance. Next, we can also have pregnancy induced hypertrophy, another example of physiological hypertrophy. The uterus is going to be undergoing hypertrophy in order to accommodate the growing fetus. So, because as the fetus grows, the uterus is going to be expanding through hypertrophy of the smooth muscle cells, and it allows the accommodation of the increasing size of the baby. Hormonal hypertrophy, for instance, estrogen during pregnancy promotes uterine hypertrophy, and growth hormone, for example, can increase skeletal muscle size. So, certain hormones can stimulate hypertrophy, whether it's estrogen for pregnancy or menstrual cycle, or growth hormone, and even testosterone can enhance skeletal muscle hypertrophy, which increases the size and the strength of these individual muscle fibers. So, now that we covered the pathological and the physiological hypertrophies, it could be very obvious what the clinical relevance of hypertrophy is. Because hypertrophy isn't just a process that's happening in the body, it has clinical implications, which are very real. The pathological hypertrophy, especially when it's chronic, it can lead to organ dysfunction. So, chronic hypertrophy can impair organ function, such as, for example, when we look back to hypertensive heart disease, um, the heart is not going to be functioning properly. This means that there's going to be reduced efficiency. And even, for example, in obesity, obesity related metabolic dysfunction can even lead to further disease. So these are very important clinical relevance of hypertrophy. Again, also the potential for heart failure. So when the left ventricle hypertrophy occurs in response to hypertension, it can eventually progress to heart failure. Why? Because the heart is not able to keep up, and the heart is now stiff and inefficient, and therefore it leads to heart failure. Also, chronic obesity. So, adipocyte hypertrophy contributes to insulin resistance and increases cardiovascular disease, like we mentioned. So, basically, the pathological conditions go hand in hand with the clinical relevance of hypertrophy. Again, the insulin resistance is going to be leading to type 2 diabetes and even more further increased cardiovascular risks and can be very dangerous for the patients. Before we wrap up, it's very important to know the difference between hypertrophy and hyperplasia. The next video is going to be about hyperplasia, but I already put all of the difference between hyperplasia and hypertrophy in two tables. This and the next page is going to be the continuation of this table. You can sit down and read this and memorize this. It's much easier to look through this. It's the exact same things we said throughout this video. Uh, so this can be very helpful for your revision. You can take screenshots of it. Right, so before we wrap up this session, it's very important to note these two parts about hypertrophy, so that later on when we finish hyperplasia, you can easily compare these. The reversibility. So, hypertrophy can be reversible or irreversible. It all depends on the cause. So, let's say the cause is physiological hypertrophy, whether it's exercise induced or pregnancy related, whether it's skeletal muscle or heart muscle, myocardial tissues. Does not matter because even pregnancy related issues, by the way, can result in hypertrophy of in the heart, for example. Um, these are going to be reversible. Why? Because the moment the stimuli is removed, everything goes back to normal. For example, if the problem was exercise, you stop exercise, everything goes back to normal. If it's pregnancy, after the pregnancy is over, everything goes back to normal. But let's say it's pathological hypertrophy. For example, if there is chronic hypertension or obesity, This can become a problem. Why? Because it can lead to structural damage and fibrosis, and these are irreversible. Okay, so that's the problem with hypertrophy. It can be reversible at certain points, and sometimes it's not reversible. And then we have cancer risk. So it's important to note that chronic hypertrophy, especially in obesity, and it can result in hormonal imbalances. They result in an increase in cancer risk because it can promote inflammation, hormonal stimulation, and excessive cell growth signals. So, but generally, it's very low risk and way less extreme, especially when we compare it later on to hyperplasia. But it is still possible. This wraps up our discussion on hypertrophy. We covered its mechanisms, causes, key clinical examples, and many more. In the next video, we're going to be breaking down hyperplasia and how it differs from hypertrophy, and also its clinical significance, and so on. Stay tuned, and thank you.